Welcome to the November 2016 Windows Server Update. In this update, we'll cover off some of the pieces we went through on the recent Windows Server Roadshow, where we announced the availability of Windows Server 2016 and went through quite a few different topics related to Windows Server 2016 Standard and Data Center, just to cover off some of the new and enhanced capabilities as well as some of the new licensing changes. So, as in some of the previous sessions, we're focused a bit more heavily on some of the technical features and capabilities. In this one, it's more of a back to basics, covering off some of the pieces around availability, the different licensing changes, and I guess just really the important things that you do need to be aware of. So as part of this, and some of these will be a recap based on things we've discussed as we go through the presentation, is just some of the frequently asked questions that did come up on the roadshow, just to make sure that these are probably some of the things you're probably thinking about as well. So just making sure that you've actually got some good information and we can send you out to some different sites to get the information you need. And then finally, in the resources section, just a quick update on some of the upcoming events, some of the locations you can go to, including coming out and revisiting the new revamped Smart HQ website. So let's jump in and talk about Windows Server 2016 for OEM and system builders. So as you can see here, we'll have three different versions of Windows Server available through the OEM and System Builder channel. So the lineup hasn't really changed. We've still got Essentials Edition, which has got some incremental capability updates. We've got Windows Server Standard Edition, and then we've got Windows Server Data Center Edition. But what you'll notice with Data Center Edition is inside of that red, the highlighted red box, you'll see that we've actually got some additional high-end features that are available once again as data center only features. So these include some of the, I guess, the headline features such as storage replica, storage spaces direct, some of the new virtual machine protection technologies, as well as the new overarching networking stack that's been scaled down from Azure to on-prem environments. Now, what's important to understand with these is that for organizations that have got requirements for those, generally they're not going to be the typical SMB customer that buys Windows Server Standard through the OEM channel. So in terms of the hardware requirements they have, in terms of the deployment and maintenance skills that they're going to require, they're really not something that at this point is targeting that SMB space. But as we've covered in some of the previous webinar recordings, there are plenty of new features that have been rolled into Standard, and you'll see some of those available in Essentials. If you are interested in those, take a look at previous month's recording of the blog, especially the ones that focused on Windows Server Standard. And also take a look at the OEM team blog site, where we do cover off in a series of 11 articles some of the new things that are included in Standard as well as Data Center, just so that you've got a really strong understanding of what the feature differences are between them. To give an indication of Windows Server 2016 available, well, as you can see in this chart, it's available now. So it went into distribution in October. But important things to know is that even though Windows Server 2012 R2 is not available through the volume licensing channel anymore, what you can see here is that it's still got over a year's left of life in it yet. So from when you see this recording in November 2016, there'll actually be a year and a month of availability. So it goes end of license through OEMs at the end of December in 2017. So we're still a fair way off. Now, for those of you who still really need to buy Windows Server 2012, that goes end of license at the end of this year, so just keep that one in mind. So now let's take a look at some of the changes that have occurred with licensing. So this is really where the big change in licensing has started taking place. If we think about Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2 standard, really the licensing was around if you've got two physical CPUs, which covers pretty much most of the system builder and OEM channel, you've got license for up to two VMs for two Windows Server VMs across those two CPUs. But now the change has actually kicked in, and it's now that you actually are looking at doing licensing based on the number of cores. So what does that actually mean? So first up, we still take the two physical CPUs and two VM rights and apply those to Windows Server Standard. But now we also have to think about how many cores do we have spread across the CPUs we've got in the system. So in a 2 CPU system, even if it's only got one CPU in it, we've got the right to 16 cores. So that means we can break that down and say, well, does that mean I could have a single CPU with 16 cores? Yes. Does it mean you could have two CPUs with 8 cores each? And once again, the answer is yes. So that's really the major change that's occurred. So if you're selling dual CPU servers of 8 cores or less, there's not really a big change in terms of the licensing, but it's once you start looking at CPUs that have got more than 8 cores, so things like your 10, 12 on upwards, they're the ones where you need to start thinking about what the actual impact is. So if you take a look at how it works, well, the base licensing is still the same in terms of CALs, so you still need to buy CALs the same way you've traditionally purchased CALs. And then if we take a look at the three rules that they apply, each server must be licensed for a minimum of 16 cores, which I mentioned. Each of those processors must be licensed for a minimum of 8 cores. And again, the rights for those initial two VMs are only granted when all cores have been licensed. So if you need to go through and license for 4 virtual machines instead of 2 virtual machines, effectively what you do is just go through and double that base requirement again. So you make sure that all the appropriate all of the cores are licensed, and then you just double it or triple it if you want to go from 1 copy of standard to 2 copies of standard to 3, so that you're going from 2 to 4 to 6 virtual machines, for example. So it's not particularly difficult when we start looking at some of these types of scenarios. But of course, as we start expanding out, some of the important things here are that we need to sort of bear some things in mind, is that all physical cores must be licensed. Now there is an exception that we'll cover a bit later, which is it's only physical cores which are exposed to the operating system in hardware. So if you've disabled CPU cores for a variety of reasons that we'll cover later in the presentation, you may you may be able to sort of stick with some of the base licensing options that you've been used to. Now again, that 8 cores per processor is the minimum, and you get 16 cores included with a standard license. Now bear in mind, this is very different to the way that it works in volume licensing, so do not try to apply some of this logic that we're using here to volume licensing. This is really only directly addressing the Windows Server OEM purchases. If you've got questions around the volume licensing piece of Windows Server, please reach out to your Microsoft distributor and they'll be able to walk you through that process. So as we go through a few scenarios now, just to put things in perspective, with the first server, this falls into that category of 2 processors, 8 cores each. Therefore, we've got 16 cores or less, so we're actually covered there. With server number 2, we've got 1 CPU, but even though it's got more than 8 cores, 12 cores is okay because it's still less than 16. So we could have 16 cores or less and still be covered by that base Windows Server Standard license. Once we get to number 3, this is where you can start seeing where things will start kicking in differently, in that all of a sudden, we can't just buy a base Windows Server Standard license because we've got more than 16 cores in total. In this case, we've got 24 cores, and we'll talk about what the impact of that is as we go through the next few slides. So first up, if we take a look at what products are going to be available in ways through the different OEM channels. First up, you'll see that we've got that standard and data center license that includes 16 cores. So effectively, this is going to be the replacement for the current Windows Server 2012 R2 standard license. But what you'll also notice though is we've also got a base license that covers 24 cores. So that way, if you've got someone who says, look, I don't want to have to buy the base license and then start buying additional core licenses, if you've got two CPUs with 12 cores each or less, you can just buy the one-off base license that includes 24 cores and you're covered there. Now once we start taking a look at the additional core licenses, let's just say that we had an 18-core server or a 20-core server. What we could do is buy that base 16-core license and then buy additional licenses out of these for the point of sale. So basically we stack the licenses until we've got coverage for what's required. So once again, it's something that in your typical single or dual proc environment, it's not going to be particularly complicated. Now, where things have started changing, and some of these changes started coming through with Windows Server 2012 R2 over the course of the last year or so, is we've got some additional products now that are available in the OEM channel, and these are the after point of sale with reassignment rights. And if we take a look at standard, what you can see here is we've got additional license to cover 16 cores, 4 cores, or 2 cores. So we can go through and get an additional Windows Server license to cover additional VM workloads that we decide to run after the fact. So if we start off with a 16 core server, and then we decide we actually don't want to run 2 VMs, we want to run 4 VMs, well, in that case, we'd need to buy another 16 cores with reassignment rights. And the beauty of using the reassignment right option here is that we can then go through and migrate that to new hardware on top of the existing base license that new hardware provides. So we can basically keep moving this additional license from one server to another. Now, important notes with that one is that this is not the base license. This requires a base license on the hardware for Windows Server before you can apply this. Now, the second one, the data center with reassignment rights, this was available with Windows Server 2012 R2. It was introduced late last year. And what this includes is reassignment with for up to 16 cores. So some important things around this one to begin with. The first one is that you've got when you are looking at reassignment rights, we are talking about basically conforming to the normal rules that software assurance works with for reassignment, which is effectively every 90 days we can go through and reassign the software license to new hardware. So this isn't something that you can move more frequently between servers than every 90 days. So bear that in mind. And if you've been used to that that framework for software assurance, effectively, as I said, it's the same framework that's being applied here. Now, there is a pricing calculator that you can download from aka MS SVR 2016 Calc, and this will give you a good idea of how to figure out the number of cores that are required, which of the SKUs may be appropriate for you. So that's something that you can download and take a quick look at, and basically use it as one of the tools in your toolkit to make sure that you are quoting appropriately. So now as we take a look at the cost comparison, what you can see here is that for single or dual core servers, as long as we're staying within that under that 16 total cores per server, what you can see there is that there's no pricing change. So whether we're running 2 VMs or we're stacking 2 copies and running 4 VMs, there's no pricing change that we need to be concerned about. However, what you'll see though is once we go beyond that 8 cores per CPU in a dual core environment, once we get up to 20 cores, well, effectively there we've got 25% more cores. So effectively we're going to see a price increase over and above the 16 core version of 25%. And then that also applies once we do start stacking VMs as well. So making sure when you are stacking VMs, you have to make sure you've got all of the underlying cores appropriately licensed. So now let's just go through some generic messaging around why choose an OEM server license. So one of them is that it's very simple, and a lot of the time the OEM licensing is very, very cost effective compared to some of the other licensing options. Now also when you are buying through multinational OEMs, for example, you'll also find that they've got things like ROK available for you, so that you can do an installation, or the OEM you work with might do pre-installation. They configure it, they make sure everything's working, they install their update tools, etc., so that that you're always going to have a good experience with that hardware. And you also get support included by the OEM rather than having to take up a paid support option with Microsoft. It can be a one-stop shop, so basically go through, you can do in one transaction, you can sell hardware, you can sell the operating system, you can sell the CALs, with no requirement for the customer to go through and have some kind of volume license agreement with Microsoft. Now, some of the important pieces that people generally don't quite understand so well with OEM server licensing, even though these things haven't really changed, is first of all that you do get the same downgrade rights as a volume license customer. The trick here is that a downgrade right is the right for you to use, for the customer to use their previous media and their previous product key to do an installation onto the new hardware. Now, where this causes confusion, if someone says, well, I buy through volume license, and volume license, the downgrade rights include the ability to get access to the older media and keys. Well, that's not actually part of the downgrade rights. That's just one of the volume license benefits. So even though it's easy to sort of get that intertwined with the concept of downgrade rights, they are two very separate things. But the downgrade rights themselves are effectively the same. So the other piece that we have here is that we've also got the portability rights. So this is the right for us to migrate virtual machines between appropriately licensed Windows Server environments. Now, if this is a large-scale environment, doing it with Windows Server Data Center is going to be the easiest way to make it easy to manage from a licensing perspective. But even with a Windows Server standard environment, you can go through and do things like live migrations, etc. But what you need to make sure, though, is that you do have the appropriate number of licenses for each VM that you're running on that particular server. So remember, with Windows Server Standard, it includes a base license for 2 Windows Server virtual machines. So if you need to move a third or a fourth VM over to it, you'll need to make sure that you do have those licenses stacked. But then once you've got appropriate licenses, you can migrate them freely, but again, as long as you're not exceeding what the base hardware is actually licensed appropriately for. Now, the other thing, and this is one that we just discussed, is that you've also got license reassignment rights with particular licenses. So the point of sale additional license, as well as the data center with license reassignment. So these don't get backported to any other type of license. You have to specifically purchase the licenses that include that functionality. So let's just debunk some of the myths, and some of these we can go through quickly because we already covered some of these to a degree. But the first one, there's still a bit of some misunderstanding out there, people saying that you can't do virtualization with OEM Server. But effectively, if a product has got virtualization rights with Windows, so with Windows Server versions have got virtualization rights, they also apply just as much to the OEM Server side. Because OEM licenses are tied to hardware, VMs can't be moved between servers. Well, this is the one that we just addressed. The important thing to understand here is that the other servers that you're moving to need to be appropriately licensed, and that's really the only trick to that. Now, we also have just seen that OEM server licenses can come with reassignment rights, but it's only for particular editions. So in this case, it's the Server 2016 Standard Additional License and the Windows Server 2016 Data Center with reassignment. We just also covered off OEM server licenses do in fact come with downgrade rights, but again, it's the customer's the requirement there to exercise that is the customer needs to have access to the earlier media and the earlier product key. Now, if you do get into a situation where the customer wants to exercise downgrade rights, but they don't have the ability to they don't have access to older media or anything like that, and they need to obtain it legally. Well, that ties into the next piece, which is within 90 days, you can attach software assurance to an OEM purchase. So if they attach software assurance to that OEM purchase, that means that they get access to the Volume License Center. So not only do they still have the downgrade rights, but now they can actually exercise those by getting access to software assurance benefits through the Volume License Center. So the summary of the Windows Server 16 launch content, it addresses a lot of the issues that SMBs are facing today and really starts setting them up for great growth. And this is really regardless of whether the customer is looking to keep technology on-prem or looking at doing some degree of cloud integration. So it's really up to you and your customer to figure out what the steps are to move particular workloads to the cloud. Now, when you do start looking at some of the more advanced capabilities in Windows Server 2016, these are only available in Data Center Edition, back like we had in 2008 R2 and earlier. Now, OEM licenses are generally the most cost-effective way to obtain good working installations, and now, as number 5 states, you've seen that we do have some new license reassignment rights. And finally, CALs are required with Windows Server 2016 Standard and Data Center. Choose user or device CALs based on the types of approaches you would have taken in the past. So let's just recap a few of the frequently asked questions that we got during the roadshow. One of them that came up is, if I disable physical cores at the hardware level, do I need to license them for Windows Server 2016? And as you can see here, it says no. It's only those which are enabled in the hardware. So this means that if you, for some reason, get a really good deal on a dual 16-core server, but it's running, you actually want the CPUs to run at a higher frequency, for example, rather than running all of those cores, because you've got a particular workload, or you might have a power envelope in which they need to operate. As long as those CPUs aren't being exposed from the BIOS or the firmware out to the underlying operating system or virtualization platform, you don't need to be licensed for those. But as soon as they are enabled and the hypervisor or the operating system sees them, you do need to make sure that you get additional licenses to cover them. So on a related topic, does hyperthreading impact core count? No, it's only the physical cores. So it could be 8 cores with hyperthreading, therefore you might see 16 cores per CPU inside of Task Manager, but technically it's only 8 cores, so you only need to license for 8 cores. Now, this was one that sort of struck up some interesting conversations during the roadshow, and it's what services require a Windows Server CAL. And effectively, it's anything that effectively accesses a service or accesses software on Windows Server. It requires a CAL. So this includes things like Active Directory, DNS, DHCP. So it doesn't matter how big or how small the service is, effectively you do need to have a CAL for that. And this is one that seemed to cause a bit of confusion, so I just thought I'd include this one to clarify, even though it's not really Server 2016 related. Now, this is one that I covered in some of the scenarios, but I thought it was worth revisiting, primarily to call out scenarios around if you've got less than 16 cores, 16 to 24 or 17 to 24 cores, or 25 or above cores. But if the server's got less than 16 cores, then just buying one copy of standard, as long as 2 VMs is all you need, one copy of standard will cover you, and that gives you the 16 cores. But then at the once you get up to 24, that's where you might want to buy the additional 2 or 4 core packs to get to the number that's right for you. Then as soon as you do get to 24, well, obviously with 24, if you can get a hold of the version of Windows Server with 24 cores included, then that's a great place to start. And then on top of that, you just start buying the additional core packs in the numbers that are required for you. So they'll be available in packs of 2, 4, and 16 cores. So you really just build it out until you meet the core requirements. Now, another piece that came up was around Nano Server. Does it require software assurance? And if you're just using it from a dev and test perspective, no, it doesn't. But as soon as you deploy Nano Server in production, it actually does require software assurance. So again, remember you've got that 90-day window to add software assurance to an OEM product. So regardless of whether it's standard or data center, if Nano is in your future or your customer's future, make sure that software assurance is part of that conversation. Now, just to go with the last question, what if I'm running Windows Server 2016 on top of a virtualization platform such as Hyper-V? Well, this doesn't affect, so this normally gets asked in terms of, what if I'm only assigning 2 cores each to 2 VMs, for example? Well, that's not really part of the conversation. You're actually licensing the underlying hardware, not the virtualization platform or not the number of cores the VMs themselves see. So if it's a 16-core server, you need 16 cores licensed. If it's 24 cores, you need 24 cores licensed, for example. So running on top of Hyper-V or different offerings from VMware or another virtualization platform doesn't really change what the underlying operating system licensing requirements are. So let's just wrap up now with some of the resources. So first up, the next major event that's going to be happening in Australia is the Microsoft Ignite Australia 2017 event early next year on the Gold Coast. So there's a lot of information already up on the website there, so take a look. And this is like Microsoft's big technical event in Australia, so take a look there to see what's happening. Now, other resources closer to the OEM piece is the OEM team blog site. So a lot of the information we talk about in this series of webinars gets included in this site. So that's a great place for you to check out all of this information. Now we've got the OEM Server AU pre-sale support line, so you can contact us via that if you've got pre-sales information requests on Microsoft OEM Server products. So note that this is pre-sales, it's not post-sale support. If you do need post-sale support on products, either calling product support or going into the support forums is your best bet for assistance there. And finally, Smart HQ is being revamped, so go and take a look. So it's going through some changes around, the old rewards program is being retired, but it's still going to be the site from the OEM team that focuses on, sales, technical, marketing information for Windows 10, Office Server, as well as, the different Windows devices that are available. So that brings us to a close for this month's recording. So hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at Windows Server 2016. If you haven't, take a look at the series of blog posts or the links that you used to get to this recording, and you'll probably find that you should be able to see links to download the evaluation edition so you can get an idea of how it works before you start deploying it out to your customers.